Welcome to the Mind Bend, where we discuss everything from conspiracy.
They were riding in an open automobile when the shots were fired. The president, his limp body carried in the arms of his wife Jacqueline, has rushed to Parkland Hospital.
History.
It's now universally agreed that the cataclysm was caused by a 6-mile wide chunk of rock.
Murder.
Chris Watts handcuffed and head down in court on Tuesday as he was charged with the premeditated murders of his pregnant wife.
And all things strange. Let's dive on in. What is going on, everybody? Welcome back. This is going to be the first episode in a brand new series called The Mind Bend, and I'm super excited to have you guys here today. So just a few housekeeping things before we kick off. Any emails can go to themindbendpodcast@gmail.com. If you guys have any questions, comments, or ideas about the show, please do shoot me an email over there. And if you're an Anchor member, you can leave me a voicemail message. And today we're going to be talking about MKUltra. That's right, Mind Control Ultra. Now, some people would say this is a conspiracy theory, but a lot of the information from this is now available publicly and you can read online. So I encourage you to do some of your own research. All right, let's dive into it. So basically, it's early 1950s, 1953. It's the peak of the Cold War era. Alan Dulles is the director of the CIA and is trying to find techniques to extort the truth out of enemy spies and to manipulate their behavior. So to do this, the CIA illegally conducted hundreds of experiments on thousands of US and Canadian citizens between 1953 and 1973 when this investigation officially stopped. And we'll dive into some of the more prolific experiments and things that went on, but it was a range of things from drugs such as LSD, psilocybin, heroin. CIA even had safe houses and prostitution rings, which was known as Operation Midnight Climax. They had stockpiles of toxins. They were tampering with these toxins to try and play with the central nervous system of humans. There were hypnosis techniques, trickery, deception, all sorts. But first off, we're going to look at the CIA and LSD. So this part of things are headed by a man by the name of Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb was the son of a Hungarian Jewish immigrant and was born in the Bronx. From here, later on in his life, he joins the CIA as a poisons expert and headed the chemical division of the technical services staff. Gottlieb's main nickname was the Black Sorcerer. He supervised preparations of lethal poisons and drug experiments during MKUltra. He believed with the administration of LSD that the drug could harness mind-altering properties for which brainwashing and psychological torture would ensue. There was even one case where they administered LSD to a man straight for 174 days. And often the patients or the people that they were administering this to had no idea they'd been given the drugs and were then left to just feel the onset of this without being aware of what was happening. One of the victims of this was Frank Olson, who was a CIA scientist that had been fed LSD. On November the 19th, 1953, Frank and 11 other members of the TSS went to have a meeting at the Deep Creek Lake. The men enjoyed a hearty dinner and then settled into the cabin's living room for after-dinner drinks. The chief director, Sidney Gottlieb, and his deputy then served Frank and the other members a bottle of liqueur that had been laced with LSD. Now, they didn't tell any of the researchers that they'd been laced with this drug, and as the effects went on, everybody started to laugh and giggle and trip balls. However, Frank couldn't really handle it. He basically had a bad trip, started to rant and rave, and became almost psychotic. So he returns home, spends the weekend with his family. His wife noticed that he'd been a little bit depressed, and then at the start of that week, he tells his boss that he wants to resign from the bio-warfare program. The same day, Olson and two colleagues known by Ruitt and Lashbrook fly to New York. From there, at around 2 a.m. on Saturday, November the 28th, 1953, Olson is staying in the hotel room with the two previously mentioned colleagues, in which he plummets out onto the sidewalk from the 10th floor and dies. All of this is then basically written off that Frank had a fatal mental breakdown and had committed suicide, in which case his family also weren't aware about the LSD incidents until later in the early 1970s when the Rockefeller Commission went through all these documents and such. There's actually a really good documentary on Netflix about this called Wormwood, and I recommend that you go and have a look at that. Back into some of the other experiments. Now let's look at Operation Midnight Climax. This is everything that's in the name. They pretty much set up rooms in San Francisco and other buildings around the place where they'd furnish the rooms, install two-way mirrors which they'd have agents sitting on the other side of, and then prostitutes would go out and find subjects at pubs, clubs and bars and bring them back to the room for sex. But meanwhile, they've been dosed with LSD and were unaware of this, and the agents on the other side of the mirror would be taking notes on how the LSD had affected the subjects. After hundreds of subjects were exposed to LSD, they figured out it wasn't really the perfect substance for this, as the results varied too much. They were after something that could induce amnesia so that the subject would forget what had happened, but also make them subservient. And that's where in 1957 we get introduced to Dr. Ewan Cameron. Now this guy is pretty fucked up all in all. He thinks he's got the answer of how to make this perfect candidate. Basically, the way he'd do things is he'd induce them into electroshock therapy until their body wouldn't pulse anymore. Then he'd feed them up on a cocktail of drugs and put locked helmets on their heads that would play the same recorded message from a tape recorder for weeks on end to try and brainwash them. From here, to make them forget about this, they would dose them up to sleep on a cocktail of drugs for up to 30 days. Meanwhile, this whole time he was telling everyone it was just part of a normal therapeutic session. None of this sounds therapeutic to me, and this is just straight brainwashing. And what's even worse is that this character then later became known worldwide as the first chairman of the World Psychiatric Association, as well as the president of the American and Canadian Psychiatric Associations. So let's jump forward to 1973. Amid a government-wide panic caused by the Watergate scandal, the then current CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all MKUltra files to be destroyed. Although most of these documents were destroyed, making a full investigation of MKUltra nearly impossible, over 20,000 documents survived as they'd been incorrectly stored in a financial records building and were later discovered. These documents were then fully investigated during the Senate hearings of 1977. However, let's jump forward then to 1974, a year later, and the New York Times alleged that the CIA had conducted illegal domestic activities, including experiments on US citizens during the 1950s and 60s. That report prompted investigations by the United States Congress in the form of the Church Committee and by a commission known as the Rockefeller Commission that looked into the illegal domestic activities of the CIA, the FBI, and other intelligence-related agencies of the military. A report was later released, however it contained little details due to most of the records being destroyed. And as for Sidney Gottlieb, he had retired from the CIA 2 years previous to this. Even though he was interviewed by the committee, he claimed to have very little recollection of the activities from the time of MKUltra. Following the recommendation of the Church Committee, President Gerald Ford in 1976 issued the first executive order on intelligence activities, which among other things prohibited the experimentation with drugs on human subjects except with informed consent, in writing and witness by disinterested party of such a human subject. And in accordance with the guideline issued by the National Commission, subsequent orders by Presidents Carter and Reagan expanded the directive to apply any human experimentation. So, all in all, there were some pretty scandalous things that went on here. We haven't really covered the entire thing. There were a lot of conspiracies to do with Charles Manson as well, involved with the CIA and the LSD programs. And I think it's just a reminder that a lot of things fly under the radar that we don't know about. So that's going to be it for this one, guys. If you've got any questions or comments, please do feel free to email me at themindbendpodcast@gmail.com. All right, until the next one, thank you.